Welcome back, everybody. I thought I would jump back in with this Gridtie inverter and explain why we're doing it, what we hope to accomplish, and the approach I took to this, and where we're at. This thing, the sun's almost completely down out of the usual zone where we're going to make a lot of power, and we're still producing, between 200 and 300 watts, maybe a little less right now. And it's working really good. Today we produced right about 20 kilowatts of power, and that's only with half the array, the half of the planned array up right now. That's 12 panels, and they're used panels, and I've got 12 more. Actually, I've got 10 more right now. I'm going to pick up 2 more tomorrow and complete the array. And hopefully that'll pretty much max out this 6 kilowatt inverter. And in a few minutes, I'll explain why I switched inverters. If you watch the last video, you'll see a different inverter. You'll see a Sunny Boy, and it just flat didn't work for me. But I'll explain that in a few minutes. First, I want to kind of go into why we decided to jump back onto this whole solar thing again. Before I forget, and I don't want to do it at the end of the video again, we've got some of these ham Homestead hats up for sale to help support the channel a little bit for some of our regular subscribers. If you'd like to help the channel, I'll put the information in the description below. And we've got 3 different styles of hats: this khaki, a black hat with a more simple logo, and then a trucker style hat too. So if you're interested, into the description below. So solar really wasn't on my radar this year at all. I mean, I've thought about it a few times doing a Gridtie system, not any serious thought about it. And then I just happened to stumble across, I was looking for something else and stumbled across some solar panels on eBay that seemed like a really reasonable price. And I think on eBay they were selling for, I want to say $65 for a 245 watt panel, which is pretty cheap. It's around 25 cents a watt. And I just happened to notice that, hey, this guy's in Nampa, Idaho, which isn't too far from me, a couple hours away. I'm going to buy a few and then go talk to him and see if I can buy a few more and maybe get a little reduced rate if we don't have to deal with the eBay thing. And sure enough, I went over and talked to him. And while I was there, I said, hey, would you be willing to sell me some more of these? And he said, sure. And he sold them to me at their lot price of, I think they sell them on eBay for the same price. If you buy a lot of 30 of them, you buy them for 60 watts or 60 bucks a panel, which equals like 24 cents a watt. After looking at the panels, these things are in outstanding condition. I have no complaints at all with the panels. In fact, sun midday, they're producing not 245 watts, but more around 250 to 260 average is what I'm getting out of those panels, at least on cooler days. I'm sure on warmer days that's going to go down a little bit, but I have no complaints with these panels at all. And I'll leave the contact information for Bob at Advanced Solar below. Like I said, I'm going back tomorrow. I'm picking up a couple more panels to finish up my second array to max this system out. And I just can't say enough good about these panels for the price. They also sell brand new panels, and I think their prices are pretty good. I don't know them off the top of my head, but give Bob a call or text him, either way. Prices are really good, and they do ship nationwide. Anyway, kind of got sidetracked there. So I saw these panels, and I thought, this kind of floated back in my head. Maybe we want to try a Gridtie system. I didn't want to go back off-grid, and I'll tell you why. It's just a matter of convenience. We lived off-grid for a while, loved the place we were at, didn't love the off-grid living as much because I like to run welders and big table saws and stuff that uses a lot of power. And with a off-grid system, you're somewhat limited. You can build a system that can match those requirements, but it's going to cost quite a bit of money. So I didn't really want to go back to completely off-grid. I wanted the convenience of grid. When you go off-grid, one of my subscribers said this to me, and kind of rung true, is when you go off-grid, you're taking the responsibility over from the power company. You're taking that, over 100 years that it took to build our infrastructure, our grid, and saying, to heck with that, I'm taking this responsibility on myself, which is excellent that you want to do that. I just don't want to do it again right now. And now I'm building this system to where it's easy to switch over to off-grid if I ever wanted to. I'm making documentation to here's how you rewire this to lower the voltage down. Because right now, with the 12 panels, we're like, numbers off the top of my head, but it's around 450 up to 500 volts open circuit voltage. Well, most off-grid charge controllers will not accept that amount of voltage. None that I've seen anyway. Some of them will go up to about 250 volts. So it'd be pretty easy to rewire. I'd have to run more wire because what the advantage of running a higher voltage is you don't need to run this ungodly sized wire into your charge controller. You can use pretty small wire. Like this is 10 gauge coming in here and it's working just fine. But if you switch that around to a lower voltage, you're going to have to use larger gauge wire, so on and so forth. But we could switch over to off-grid if we wanted to or needed to down the road. We just have to rewire. And obviously, if we want to run this much power, we'll have to have a different inverter. This inverter will not do that. And the reason is a grid tie inverter, these are required to have an anti-islanding feature. And where they come up with that name is beyond me, but it means that if the grid goes down, this thing shuts off and it doesn't backfeed into the grid. If there's somebody out working on a line, you don't want this thing feeding back into the grid. And so as soon as that grid goes down, this thing shuts off. So if you don't have any grid power coming in, this thing's kind of useless in an off-grid situation. Now, I have heard of people using another inverter to power the house off of batteries and then turning one of these on and doing that. I'm not going to try it because I don't have an inverter that I want to blow up in case it doesn't work. So I don't know. But if I'm really worried about that, I'll just get another large inverter and do it that way for an off-grid situation. So I saw these panels. I know I'm going off all over the place, but I saw these panels and I thought, I'd kind of like to be a little more energy dependent or independent and lower our power bill some. And so I decided, let's do a grid tie system. The panels, it couldn't beat the price. I think total, even with this inverter, this is a brand new inverter. It's old stock, but brand new. I think we've probably got about $2,000 maybe wrapped up into this system so far. Maybe a little bit more with the wiring, this whole rewiring mess that I went through. Probably a little bit more than that. But as far as the solar end of things, $1,500 to $2,000. That thing shipped to me was $790, I think. And I was thinking about buying another one while there's still some of these around, new in stock. And the reason I like this inverter over the Sunny Boy is the Sunny Boy one I bought was a transformerless inverter, meaning it does not have a transformer in it, which means it's not isolated from the grid. They call it the another one of those words I can't say worth a darn. Galvanic isolation. Close enough. And a transformerless inverter does not have isolation from the grid. So the DC side or the grounding side is not isolated the way I understand that those are wired. So it has to go through this whole protocol when it boots up to make sure that there's no ground faults and all this stuff. And it checks the resistance of the solar panels and goes on and on and on through all this self-testing. And with the used panels, it would not work. And the other thing you can't have with the transformerless one, at least the one that I bought, you can't have negatively grounded panels. And from the documentation, it looks like these panels were made to be negatively grounded, which with this inverter, it works absolutely fine. No problems at all. You hook it to that Sunny Boy and it shows a ground fault every time because you check with a voltmeter and it's showing voltage between negative and ground because they were made to be negatively grounded. So when you got that floating ground out there, with those particular panels, it just didn't like it. With this inverter, it's got a little fuse in there that if you do have a ground fault, I think it's a 1 amp fuse. It blows that fuse and shows an error, the inverter stops working, and you got to take care of the problem. But that other inverter, it goes through this complicated procedure to check to make sure there's no ground faults and the resistance of the solar panels. And the thing, it would boot up and it looked like it was going to work, and then it would do this. So this is the first time we booted this up. I hooked everything up, turned the power on, and went through its cycle, its boot up cycle, and immediately started showing a fault, or disturbance, as Sonny Boy calls it, a disturbance of whatever kind. Now, when this happened, I went through hours and hours of trying to make this work. At first, I grounded the solar panels thinking, well, that take care of the voltage difference between negative and ground. But then the inverter found that was grounded on the negative side and shows a fault right off the bat. So I spent a better part of a day frustrated out of my mind dealing with that inverter before I finally made up my mind that it's the solar panels themselves working with that inverter, just they flat wouldn't work. So I almost bought this inverter to start with. The other one I bought off of eBay, it was used. And I almost bought this inverter the first time around, but I bought that Sonny Boy because it was cheaper. I think I paid like $450 or so shipped to my door. And, I regret buying that inverter. It gave me nothing but headaches trying to make it work. And, it's an older inverter. I think it was made in about 2007, 8. And I hooked it up to some newer solar panels. I don't remember what the wattage equaled out to, but I got the voltage up high enough that the thing would actually turn on. And with the new panels that can use that floating ground, it worked fine, no problem. With those panels, it just flat wouldn't work. And, I debated on, do I get rid of the used panels I just bought, or do I just buy a different inverter that will work with them? Because $60 a panel for 245 watt panels, that's kind of hard to turn down. So I wound up buying this, I think it's Fronius IG Plus. It's a 6 kilowatt one. And as soon as I put it in, booted it up, absolutely no problems, immediately started feeding the grid. Now, the next thing that happened was once we started feeding the grid, that first day it was really cool out, lots of sun. The thing was putting out, with the 12 panels, about 3,400 watts of power. And I went and looked at the meter. Sure enough, it's running backwards, but it started showing an error. And I talked to the power company about a year ago about this, and nobody really knew a whole lot about it. They said, oh yeah, we do net metering, not a problem, blah, blah, blah. Well, this thing started showing an error. So I called them up and I said, what's going on? And the nice lady I talked to said, hey, we need to change your meter out to this other style of meter. And I said, okay, how do we do that? And she said, well, you have to have an electrical inspection done. Then we have to come and inspect your system. And the big thing they're looking for is they want to make sure this thing does not backfeed the grid when the grid goes down. And their documentation actually said they needed an automatic disconnect box installed, which if you've looked at the price of those, they're fairly pricey. They had almost another 50% add-on to my cost. And I sent them the documentation for this inverter, and they were easy to work with. They said, okay, yeah, yours has the anti-islanding feature, and that, as long as it's documented that it works, we're good with it. So when they come out, I expect to flip the breaker to show them this thing actually turns off when the grid goes down. And the electrical inspector, excellent to work with. I explained what I was doing. He sounds like we're both on the same page. The only difference we kind of had was the grounding thing. I'm used to grounding things, like overly grounding them because of lightning protection, and electricians kind of think of things a little different than guys that work in the communications industry. But other than that, I think we're going to be good to go. He's coming out in a couple of days. We'll get this inspected, get our meter changed, and off to the races. I wish I would have bought this inverter to start with. And looking now, I don't see a lot of inverters that have transformers in them. Most of them have went to the transformerless design. Now, I don't know if all of them are as touchy as that Sonny Boy inverter I had, but down the road I may add a second inverter at some point, not anytime soon, but I'm thinking about it. Once I max this out, if we did 20 kilowatts today, on most days during the summer, we'll probably be producing over 40 kilowatts with the rest of the array put up. So it's going to take care of our power needs for the most part. We do run a pump quite a bit in the summer. And so, but I looked at our power bills. we're either going to be selling a little bit back or pretty much breaking even, which is a good thing. So can't complain about this inverter at all. It was really easy to install. The only complaint I have is where the AC leads hook up into that thing. You do not have a lot of wiggle room in there to feed them in, especially with 8-gauge wire. It's kind of a pain to get those in there, but it turned out looking pretty good. Now, would I recommend doing a grid tie system yourself? Well, if you're electrically inclined and mechanically inclined, I see no problem with it. As I understand, some jurisdictions don't allow it. You have to have an electrical contractor come and do it, or somebody that's certified for solar come and do your system for you. Here in Oregon, our electrical inspector is pretty easy to get along with, and he works with you. If you've done something wrong, he just comes out and says, hey, we just need to change this and we're good to go. So I don't know. There may be certain jurisdictions, even here in Oregon, that they don't allow you to do it. But as far as I know, pretty much in Oregon, you can do it yourself as long as you do it right. So would I recommend doing it? Sure. One thing you really have to remember is this DC voltage, when you're bringing it in with these string inverters, it is high voltage. You're talking, 300, 400, 500. This is pushing between 450 and 500 volts. The maximum this inverter will take is 600 volts open circuit. So you got to remember with DC, when you're working with DC, it's a little bit different beast than AC. It's much more prone to arcing because AC, every 60 times a second, it crosses 0 volts. So it gives a chance for that arc to break. Well, when you're working with 500-600 volts DC, it doesn't go to 0. If it starts an arc, it's hard to break. You got to get a pretty good gap there to break that arc. So the switches are special. Do not use AC style switches. Do not use AC breakers. There's special breakers for this high voltage DC and special switches for the DC. And if you ever work with one of these DC switches, you'll notice it feels spongy, like nothing's happening, and then all of a sudden click. And the reason for that is so when the switch mechanically changes inside, it's kind of spring loaded. So when you finally get there, it flips really fast to avoid arcing. So again, do not use AC rated switches, breakers, or anything. Make sure you're DC rated, especially for the voltage you're working at. And the other thing, I can't stress this enough, if you're working with this, and especially when you're at your panels, I put a disconnect right out by the panel so I could kill this feed coming in here when I need to work on anything. And there's a disconnect right at the box here. But I like to have one out by the panels. When you're working with those wires out on that end, if they're hot, make sure you only strip one side of that and put a MC4 or whatever connector you're using, most likely an MC4 connector. Make sure you put that connector on there so that connection, that open wire is covered and you do not have both leads ever out open at the same time. You're just asking for trouble if you do that. Make sure you're only working on either the negative or positive. Get that thing with a cover on it and be done with it. And you really shouldn't need to be working with that high of voltage with these MC4 connectors. Like when I made the jumpers to go down to the disconnect, I made the jumper so there's not any voltage on it, and I just clip it in and you're done. But if you do, for some reason, have to work on that, remember, one at a time. A lot of guys that are used to working on 12, 24 volts or whatever DC, you get this really bad habit. I'm just as guilty as anybody of this. You strip both sides off when you're putting some connector on or whatever. So you've got negative and positive out there. It's not a big deal. You can short it out and cause a big problem if it's not fused, but you don't have a lot of arcing potential there. This is a different beast, so just be aware of that if you do decide to tackle this, that you are working with pretty high voltage DC, and it's nothing to play around with. If you're uncomfortable with it, hire an electrician to do that part, and you can do a lot of the other work, but hire somebody that knows what they're doing. So the sun went down a little bit more. We're at about 160, 170 watts right now. That darn tree out there, it needs trimmed really bad. I knew it when I put the panels there that I was going to have to do some massive whacking on that tree, because later in the afternoon, the sun's definitely not going to get on those panels, so we need to trim that tree some. Not a big deal, but something to be aware of when you install panels, to make sure that you're putting them in a position that they're not going to be blocked at certain times of the year. There's a really cool instrument, and I can't remember the name off of it. I think the company's Solar Pathfinder. And down the road, I may do a little video about these things. They're really neat. You can set them up. They're really simple. But you're probably better off borrowing one if you can find somebody that'll let you borrow one. They're pretty dang expensive. But if you're serious about solar, it's worth trying to find one. So it charts out where the sun's going to be and what's going to block the sun throughout the whole year. And it's a super simple device. Again, maybe down the road, I'll show you one and show you how the things work. But I knew that tree was going to be a problem, and we'll just trim it. In the winter, it won't be a problem at all because the sun's going to be further to the south. But the further north the sun gets, the more a problem that tree is going to be. So probably next week, I'll get out there and trim that thing. Anyway, that kind of wraps up our grid tie system. I know I didn't go really in depth on this thing, but I just wanted to kind of show you where we wound up with. And if anybody wants a Sunny Boy inverter, if you've got newer panels that it'll work with, let me know. Send me an email. Maybe we can work something out. But I'm pretty happy with this Fronius, whatever it is. And so we're going to run with it. And down the road, I'll give you an update after the inspection and let you know how that goes, and let you know how much power we're producing once we get that other array up. I don't expect to get that other array up within the next couple months. That's going to be a little bit later project. I'd like to get it up soon, but I've got a lot of other stuff on my plate, like getting out to some mines. The weather's been great, so it's time to go looking at some mines shortly. Well, for some reason, my outro didn't record right, so I guess this is going to wrap this video up. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for subscribing and taking the time to watch these videos, and we'll catch everybody on the next video.